The question nobody asks, what if everything you've been told about success is wrong? Not slightly off, not missing a piece, completely wrong. Every day, millions of Americans wake up, grind harder than anyone around them, sacrifice their weekends, skip the vacations and push themselves to the breaking point, and still wonder why the results don't match the effort. They watch people with less experience, less education, and fewer natural gifts somehow rise faster, perform better, and reach heights that seem impossible given what they started with. Here's the question that changes everything. What do those people know that you don't? It's not a better morning routine. It's not a productivity app. It's not even the right mentor or the right network. It's something deeper. Something most people never think to develop because they've been chasing the wrong thing their entire careers. The gap between someone who reaches the absolute pinnacle of human performance and someone who stays stuck in the middle of the pack has almost nothing to do with IQ, talent, genetics, or luck. Research across neuroscience, sports psychology, and performance science has been saying this for decades, and yet the message hasn't broken through. Here's the truth. Peak performance is a psychological skill, and psychological skills can be learned. The mental patterns that create extraordinary results, the exact frameworks used by the world's top athletes, CEOs, artists, and innovators, have been studied, mapped, and decoded. They are not mysterious. They are not reserved for the genetically blessed. They are learnable, repeatable, and transferable to anyone willing to do the work. But here's what makes this different from every other peak performance book you've encountered. This isn't motivation. This isn't a pep talk with a few action items stapled to the end. This is a complete psychological operating system, a rewiring of how your mind processes pressure, failure, opportunity, and growth. By the time you finish this audiobook, the way you think will be fundamentally different. You'll understand why high achievers perform the way they do. Not just what they do, but how their minds actually work in the moments that matter most. You'll have a concrete system for conditioning your own mind to operate at that same level. The journey starts with one uncomfortable question. Are you truly ready to discover what your mind is actually capable of? Because once you see it, once you understand the machinery behind elite performance, you can't unsee it. And you'll never be satisfied with average thinking again. Let's begin. The performance paradox. Why hard work alone will never be enough. Picture two people. The first has been playing piano since age 4. By the time she's 20, she can play almost anything by ear. Technically flawless. Naturally gifted. Everyone in her life has told her since childhood that she's special, that she has it. The second picked up the piano at 16. No particular gift. Had to fight for every small improvement. Failed publicly. Practiced until her fingers ached. Was told more than once she'd never make it professionally. Guess which one burns out before 30? Guess which one is still performing at 50? Still improving, still electrifying audiences. This is the performance paradox, and it shows up everywhere once you know how to see it. Walk into any major American corporation, and you'll find it. The brilliant analyst who freezes up during board presentations. The naturally charismatic salesperson who consistently underperforms when the deal actually matters. The gifted athlete who folds when the game is on the line. Meanwhile, people with half the raw ability are quietly dominating their fields. This isn't random. This isn't bad luck. This is a predictable pattern that researchers have documented across virtually every area of human performance. The data is clear, and it will disturb everything you think you know about achievement. Studies of elite performers across sports, business, the arts, and science consistently show that natural ability accounts for less than 20% of the difference between good and truly great. The other 80%? It's psychological. It's the architecture of how your mind handles pressure, processes failure, responds to feedback, and interprets adversity. Let that land for a second. 80%, which means that for every hour you spend developing a technical skill without also developing your mental framework, you're leaving 80% of your potential on the table. Now, think about the people who changed their industries, who redefined what's possible in their fields. Thomas Edison was told by teachers he was too slow to learn anything. Walt Disney was fired by a newspaper editor who said he lacked imagination. Vera Wang failed to make the Olympic figure skating team and was passed over for editor-in-chief at Vogue before building a fashion empire. Arianna Huffington's second book was rejected by 36 publishers before she became one of the most influential media figures in America. These weren't people who succeeded despite their early failures. They succeeded because of how their minds were trained to interpret those failures. The biggest lie sold to most Americans growing up is the one about natural talent, that some people just have it, that champions are born, not built, that if you're not naturally exceptional, you might as well accept your ceiling and work within it. This belief system is not just wrong, it's a trap, and millions of people are living inside it right now, unknowingly limiting their own potential by accepting a false story about how performance actually works. Here's what elite performers have figured out that most people haven't. Your mind is the hardware everything else runs on. Your skills, your knowledge, your experience, that's all software. And software can only ever run as well as the hardware underneath it allows. When the hardware is miscalibrated, when your psychological operating system is running outdated, performance-sabotaging patterns, no amount of skill development will fix it. You'll keep hitting the same invisible ceiling, wondering why the work isn't translating into results. Conversely, when you upgrade the hardware, when you retrain your mind to operate on elite psychological principles, your existing skills multiply. Things that used to feel overwhelming become manageable. Pressure that used to freeze you starts to sharpen you. Setbacks that used to derail you for weeks become data points you process in hours. This is the shift. This is what separates the people who occasionally perform well from the people who perform at extraordinary levels with remarkable consistency. The mechanism works like this. When an average performer walks into a high-pressure situation, a major pitch, a championship moment, a crucial conversation, their brain activates a survival response. Thoughts become scattered. Focus narrows onto threats. The performance state degrades. They are, in a very real neurological sense, fighting against their own brain. Elite performers walk into that same situation with the same nervous system, the same heart rate spike, the same adrenaline flood. But their minds have been trained to read those signals completely differently. Where others feel threat, they feel readiness. Where others spiral into anxiety, they channel that same energy into intensified focus. Same biology, completely different outcome. This is not metaphor. This is measurable neuroscience. The brain does not distinguish between real and vividly imagined experiences in the way most people assume. When you consistently think about pressure as something that destroys your performance, your neural pathways literally wire themselves to create a destruction response. When you train your mind to interpret pressure as a readiness signal, you wire a different response, one that enhances rather than derails your performance. You are either training your brain for peak performance, or you are training it for mediocrity. There is no neutral setting. Consider what Patrick Mahomes was doing long before anyone knew his name. Future Hall of Famer credentials aside, what made him exceptional wasn't just the arm talent. Coaches and teammates consistently describe a mind that processes the game at a different speed. The ability to remain calm when the pocket collapses, to see 3 plays ahead while executing the current one, to treat a fourth-quarter deficit as a tactical puzzle rather than a crisis. That mental architecture didn't arrive at birth. It was built deliberately, consistently, through years of conditioning his psychology to operate in ways that most players never think to train. The same principle applied to Kobe Bryant, who famously practiced shots at 4 a.m., not just for the physical repetition, but for the mental state those reps created. The absolute certainty of execution that comes from having mentally rehearsed a situation so many thousands of times that no real-world pressure can shake it. The same principle applies to Simone Biles, whose psychological resilience, her ability to process enormous public pressure, come back from devastating setbacks, and still perform at a level that makes the world's other elite gymnasts look mortal, is not a personality quirk. It's a trained psychological system. And here's the part that should excite you. What was trained by them can be trained by you. You don't need Mahomes' arm. You don't need Kobe's baseline athleticism. You don't need Biles' physical gifts, because the psychological operating system they've built, the mental framework underneath all of that, is accessible to anyone willing to develop it. The performance paradox is actually an opportunity once you see it clearly. While others are racing to develop skills on top of a crumbling psychological foundation, you have the chance to build the foundation first. While others are working harder on the 20% that determines a fifth of their ceiling, you can work on the 80% that determines the rest. The question isn't whether you have enough talent. The question is whether you're willing to build the psychology that makes talent irrelevant. The Elite Mindset Framework, 7 ways. Peak performers. Think differently. If you could pause time during the defining moment of an elite performer's career, the instant before the buzzer beater, the second before the negotiation closing offer, the breath before the performance that changes everything, and look directly inside their mind, what would you actually find? Not inspiration, not willpower, not even confidence in the way most people imagine it. You'd find structure, deliberate, systematic, deeply practiced mental architecture that processes that moment through an entirely different set of filters than the one most people use. Elite performers don't just think differently. They think from a different framework entirely. And understanding that framework is the fastest way to begin rebuilding how your own mind operates. Here's something most people miss. Your mind doesn't produce random thoughts. It produces patterns. Every response you have to a challenge, every decision you make under pressure, every interpretation you place on an event, these follow predictable pathways carved out by years of accumulated thinking habits. The problem is that most people have spent years unconsciously installing patterns that actively undermine their performance. They've rehearsed self-doubt. They've practiced catastrophic interpretation. They've reinforced the belief that pressure is dangerous rather than useful. After enough repetition, these patterns feel like reality, like accurate assessments of the world rather than trained responses that can be retrained. Elite performers have done the opposite. They've deliberately installed patterns that generate excellence and practiced them until those patterns run automatically without conscious effort, even under maximum pressure. The following 7 mental models are the core of that framework. Master them, and the way you experience every challenge, every setback, every high-stakes moment will permanently change. Mental Model 1, Outcome Independence. This is the most counterintuitive concept in elite psychology. and it's the one that most directly separates peak performers from everyone else. Average performers are emotionally attached to specific outcomes. Elite performers are obsessed with process and largely detached from results. Before you dismiss this as some kind of motivational contradiction, don't you need to care about outcomes to achieve great outcomes? Understand the neuroscience of why this works. When you're emotionally invested in a specific result, your brain shifts into a reactive state. Decision-making becomes fear-based. Your body tightens. Your thinking narrows. You stop performing and start surviving. The very attachment to the outcome you want most is what prevents you from achieving it. Think about a college basketball player at the free throw line in the final 2 seconds of a tied national championship game. The magnitude of what's at stake doesn't just fail to help. It actively degrades the motor performance that the shot requires. The player who thinks, if I miss this, everything falls apart, has just made themselves significantly more likely to miss. The elite player in that same moment isn't thinking about championships or career legacies, or what happens if the ball rims out. They're thinking about the one specific thing they can control: their mechanics. Feet square, eyes on the back of the rim, elbow aligned, follow through. Outcome independence isn't apathy. Elite performers care deeply. They just understand that the best path to the outcomes they want runs directly through complete absorption in the process that creates those outcomes. Developing outcome independence requires a specific form of practice, training yourself to find satisfaction in excellent execution, regardless of result. In low-stakes situations first, a workout, a practice presentation, a creative project, commit fully to the process without measuring the result. Build what psychologists call process confidence, the deep certainty that your execution is sound, even when outcomes are uncertain. Mental Model 2. Anti-fragility. Philosopher and scholar Nassim Taleb introduced the concept of anti-fragility to describe systems that don't merely survive stress, they actually get stronger because of it. The opposite of fragile isn't just robust. It's something that benefits from shocks. Elite performers have trained their minds to be anti-fragile. They don't just handle adversity well. They use adversity as raw material for improvement. While most people interpret obstacles as problems to avoid or survive, elite performers interpret them as information to process. The setback isn't a tragedy. It's a data point. The failure isn't evidence of inadequacy. It's a precise diagnostic tool pointing directly at the next area for growth. Consider how elite athletes use injury recovery, where most people see only lost training time, lost momentum, lost opportunities. Elite performers consistently report that injury periods force them to develop mental conditioning, strategic understanding, and technical refinements they never would have pursued otherwise. The forced detour became a competitive advantage. Anti-fragility requires fundamentally rewiring the questions you ask when adversity hits. The average mind asks, "Why is this happening to me?" The anti-fragile mind asks, "How does this make me better?" Not as a coping mechanism, not as forced optimism, as a genuine performance strategy rooted in the understanding that stress, when properly processed, is the actual mechanism of growth. Mental Model 3. Systems thinking. Most people think in events. Something happened. There was a result. They respond to the event. Elite performers think in systems. They understand that every outcome is the product of multiple interconnected processes. Change a process, and you change the output, predictably, repeatably at scale. This is what makes elite performers so astonishingly consistent. They're not relying on motivation, which fluctuates. They're not waiting for inspiration, which is unreliable. They've built performance systems. Integrated sets of preparation protocols, mental routines, recovery practices, and feedback mechanisms that generate excellent output regardless of how they feel on any given day. A systems thinker looks at a disappointing result and asks not what went wrong in that moment, but which component of my system produced this outcome and how do I optimize it? The result becomes a diagnostic output from a larger machine that can be tuned. Systems thinking also means understanding that small, consistent changes in process create enormous changes in outcomes over time. Elite performers are never looking for the dramatic breakthrough. They're looking for the marginal refinement, the 1% improvement to one component of the system, because they understand how those improvements compound. Mental Model 4. Growth Orientation. This is Carol Dweck's growth mindset concept taken to its full operational depth. Elite performers don't just believe they can improve. They have built a cognitive framework that literally processes failure differently than the average mind does. Failure, to an elite performer, is not evidence of inadequacy. It is information. Specific, actionable data about where the next improvement needs to happen. But growth orientation goes deeper than just learning from failure. It extends to how elite performers seek feedback. While most people instinctively avoid harsh criticism or become defensive when receiving it, elite performers actively seek out the most direct, unsparing feedback available. They understand that the quality of your feedback determines the speed of your improvement. Comfortable feedback keeps you comfortable. Accurate feedback makes you better. Elite performers also have a fundamentally different relationship with their own abilities. They don't say, "I'm not good at this." They say, "I'm not good at this yet." These aren't just different words. They reflect different neurological realities about whether improvement is possible, and that belief directly shapes the effort and learning that follows. Mental Model 5. Present Moment Mastery. Elite performers have developed the ability to fully inhabit the present moment during performance. This sounds simple. It is extraordinarily difficult to sustain. The human mind naturally drifts toward past mistakes, future worries, external judgments. Every moment your attention is somewhere other than right now is a moment where performance degrades. The athlete replaying last quarter's error in their head is not fully executing this quarter's play. The executive mentally rehearsing the conversation that might happen after the meeting is not fully processing the meeting in front of them. Flow states, those peak performance experiences where everything clicks, execution becomes almost effortless, and time seems to collapse, can only be accessed when attention is completely absorbed in the present moment. Elite performers develop present moment mastery through two simultaneous practices: training attention to stay in the now, and training emotional non-reactivity, the ability to notice mistakes, setbacks, and pressures without the emotional attachment that pulls them away from the present. Mental Model 6. Strategic Patience. There is a profound difference between being patient and being passive. Strategic patience means maintaining absolute clarity about long-term direction while taking aggressive, fully committed action in the present moment. It means being willing to invest years developing capabilities that won't visibly pay off for a long time, because the compound return on that investment dwarfs any shortcut. Most people lack this. They switch strategies too quickly. They abandon development work when early progress seems slow. They make short-term decisions that feel good now, but quietly undermine where they're trying to go. Elite performers think in developmental phases. They understand that compound improvement, like compound interest, rewards patience with exponential return. They're willing to be misunderstood, to look like they're falling behind in the short term, to resist the quick win that comes at the expense of the long build. Strategic patience is also the quality that allows elite performers to stay committed to their process when social pressure, from peers, family, critics, is pushing them toward a more conventional or immediately visible path. Mental Model 7. Identity Integration. The deepest and most durable shift that separates elite performers is this one. Excellence for them isn't something they do. It's something they are. Their commitment to peak performance isn't a decision they make each morning. It's built into the fabric of how they understand themselves. This identity integration creates automatic behavioral consistency that no amount of willpower can replicate. When you identify as someone who is committed to excellence, maintaining high standards doesn't require effort. It requires no effort, because it's simply the expression of who you are. The discipline becomes effortless not because the standards are lowered, but because the identity makes them automatic. Identity integration is also protective. When results fluctuate, and in every high-performing career they will, a performance identity built around process rather than outcomes keeps you psychologically stable. You don't crash when results dip, because your sense of self isn't dependent on the scoreboard. Building this kind of identity requires conscious intention. Consistently asking, what would someone committed to excellence do here, rather than, what do I feel like doing? Every aligned action strengthens the identity. Every compromise weakens it. These 7 models work together as an integrated system. When your mind operates from this framework consistently, you become more resilient under pressure. You learn faster from setbacks. You perform more consistently, and you develop the kind of sustained competitive advantage that talent alone can never deliver. The framework doesn't install overnight, but it installs. And once it does, mediocre thinking becomes genuinely uncomfortable because your mind has been optimized for something better. Mental conditioning. Building focus. That cannot be broken. Your ability to focus is under constant assault. This is not a modern cliché. It is a deliberate, engineered reality. Right now, as you're listening to this, dozens of systems built by some of the most sophisticated behavioral scientists in human history are specifically designed to capture your attention and keep it fragmented. The notification that just buzzed, the app engineered to create the same dopamine response as a slot machine, the feed designed to make it impossible to reach the bottom. These are not accidents. They are the products of billions of dollars invested in preventing you from ever achieving the deep, sustained focus that peak performance requires. The result: the average American checks their phone 96 times per day. Every single check fractures the focus state. Research shows that after each interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes to fully return to deep cognitive engagement. Do the math. Most people are operating in a permanent state of shallow cognition, constantly dipping below the surface of the deep work that actually creates transformative results. Meanwhile, elite performers operate in a different reality, not because they have superhuman willpower, because they have built systematic attention infrastructure that makes deep focus the default rather than the exception. Here's the foundational truth about focus that changes everything. Attention is not a fixed resource. It's a trainable skill. Your current attention capacity is not your permanent attention capacity. With the right conditioning approach, you can develop the focused attention capabilities that elite performers use to achieve the results that make others think they're operating at a different level. Understanding how to build this capability starts with understanding how the brain actually allocates attention. Your brain runs 2 primary attention systems. The focused attention network, based primarily in the prefrontal cortex, enables concentrated thought and deliberate cognitive work. The default mode network is what activates when you're not consciously directing your attention. the mental wandering, daydreaming, and associative thinking that happens in the background. Most people live primarily in their default mode network, even when they believe they're focusing. Their attention is reactive, jumping toward whatever grabs it rather than being consciously directed. Elite performers have learned to activate, sustain, and strategically deploy their focused attention network, to treat their own attention as a weapon rather than a resource that just happens to them. The four components of elite attention. Selective attention is the ability to zero in on what's relevant while filtering out everything else. In any performance environment, there are hundreds of things competing for cognitive resources. Elite performers have developed what researchers call attentional templates, pre-built mental maps of exactly what deserves attention in a given situation, so that the filtering happens automatically without burning cognitive bandwidth. Sustained attention is the ability to maintain focused intensity over extended periods. This is the attention component most people lack most severely in the modern environment. Elite performers have built what amounts to attentional endurance, the capacity to stay in deep focus for as long as the performance demands, without the quality degrading. Flexible attention is the ability to shift focus quickly and accurately between different tasks or different scales of the same task. High-stakes performance environments are rarely static. A quarterback needs to shift between reading the defense at the macro level and making split-second micro adjustments to his footwork. A surgeon needs to move between the broad status of the patient and the precise mechanical execution of the instrument in their hand. Flexible attention is the capacity to make these shifts efficiently, without losing quality at either scale. Meta-attention is the most sophisticated component. Awareness of your own attention. Elite performers don't just focus well, they monitor their focus in real time. They can notice the precise moment their attention begins drifting and redirect it before the drift becomes a performance-degrading spiral. This self-monitoring turns elite focus into a self-correcting system. Building the system. The foundational practice is deceptively simple. Daily mindfulness meditation. 10 minutes of breath-focused attention. When your mind wanders, you notice it, and you bring it back. That's it. That's the entire practice. But that simple practice is doing something profound at the neurological level. You are training the two core muscles of elite focus simultaneously. The noticing reflex, meta-attention, and the redirection reflex, attention control. Research consistently shows that even 8 weeks of this practice creates measurable structural changes in the prefrontal cortex. From that foundation, you add progressive attention challenges, extending the duration of focused work periods, deliberately practicing in increasingly distracting environments, and systematically removing the environmental triggers that pull your attention away from what matters. Environmental design is not optional for elite performers. They understand that willpower alone cannot sustain deep focus against a perfectly engineered attention economy. So they engineer their environment instead. Devices silenced, notifications eliminated during focus blocks, physical spaces designed to minimize visual clutter, digital environments scrubbed of the attention hooks that quietly degrade performance. Research has shown that the mere presence of a smartphone on a desk, even face down, even powered off, reduces measurable cognitive performance by up to 10%. Elite performers don't tempt fate. They remove the interference. Cognitive load management addresses the fact that your brain has finite processing capacity, and every unnecessary decision, task, or distraction depletes the resources available for performance. Elite performers aggressively automate, delegate, or eliminate non-essential cognitive tasks. Standard routines for everything from meals to morning preparation. Systems for capturing information so it doesn't have to be held in active memory. templates for recurring tasks. Every unit of cognitive bandwidth they free up from the routine is available for the exceptional. Stress inoculation training solves the most common focus failure, the ability to stay focused in low-pressure environments, but not in the ones that actually matter. Elite performers deliberately practice focusing under progressively more challenging conditions, increasing distraction, physical discomfort, time pressure, evaluative stakes. They build what amounts to pressure-resistant focus that holds up precisely when it needs to most. Recovery protocols complete the system. Focus, like physical endurance, requires recovery cycles to regenerate. Elite performers structure their work around natural attention rhythms, typically 90 to 120 minutes of intense focus, followed by genuine recovery. Not switching to a different demanding task. Actual recovery. Movement, nature, relaxation techniques that allow the focused attention network to restore its capacity. Sleep is perhaps the single most powerful focus recovery tool available. During sleep, the brain clears the metabolic byproducts of intense cognitive work, consolidates the learning from the previous day's performance, and restores the attentional resources necessary for the next day's peak output. Elite performers who treat sleep as a performance variable, who optimize their sleep environment, timing, and quality with the same rigor they apply to their training, have a compounding advantage over those who treat it as an afterthought. The result of systematic attention training is what researchers call effortless concentration, a state where the ability to focus becomes so well developed that entering deep concentration feels natural rather than effortful. You don't have to battle for focus. You simply engage it, the way a trained athlete engages a physical skill that has been practiced until it feels automatic. More than that, you develop unbreakable focus. External distractions begin to bounce off rather than penetrate. Your attention becomes a precision instrument you can deploy exactly where it's needed, for as long as it's needed, under whatever conditions arise. In an economy increasingly rewarding the capacity for deep work and increasingly populated by people operating in permanent shallow distraction, this capability is not just useful. It is becoming one of the most decisive competitive advantages available to any performer in any domain. Your focus is your superpower. It's time to build it like one. The pressure protocol. What happens in your mind at the moment that matters? Most pressure reveals everything. It doesn't create character. It exposes it. Every performer who has ever competed at a high level knows this in their bones. The moment the stakes become real, when failure has actual consequences and the people watching actually matter, something happens. Some performers elevate. Others shrink. And the gap between those two groups is almost never about skill. Here's the first thing you need to understand about pressure. The stress response your body generates in high-stakes moments was not designed for modern performance. It was designed for a world where the thing creating pressure was trying to eat you. When your brain registers a high-importance or potentially threatening situation, it triggers a cascade through your amygdala, your internal alarm system, that floods your body with cortisol and adrenaline, elevates your heart rate, accelerates your breathing, tenses your muscles, and sharpens your sensory awareness. For a Paleolithic human facing physical danger, this was perfect. Every one of those changes maximized the capacity for immediate physical response. For a startup founder presenting to investors, a trial lawyer delivering closing arguments, or a point guard handling a full-court press in a tied playoff game, these same changes can be either the fuel for peak performance or the mechanism of catastrophic failure. The determining factor is interpretation, not willpower, not grit, not telling yourself to calm down, which neuroscience has shown rarely works and sometimes makes things worse. Interpretation. The story your trained mind tells about what the physiological sensations of pressure mean. Average performers have trained themselves, usually without realizing it, to interpret the stress response as evidence that something is wrong. Heart racing? I'm nervous. I'm not ready. Palms sweating. I'm losing control. Heightened sensitivity to everything in the environment? I'm overwhelmed. This interpretation is not just inaccurate, it is self-fulfilling. Because now you're not just dealing with the pressure of the original situation. You're dealing with the additional anxiety of being stressed about being stressed. The spiral compounds itself. Elite performers have trained their minds to interpret those exact same physiological signals as evidence that something is right. Heart rate elevated? I'm activated. My system is ready. Adrenaline flowing? I've got everything I need for this moment. Heightened awareness. I'm dialed in. Same body, same nervous system, completely different performance outcome. This reframing isn't a trick. It isn't fake positivity. It is a neurologically accurate interpretation of what the stress response actually represents. Your biology mobilizing its full resources for what it has correctly identified as an important moment. Elite performers simply train themselves to read the mobilization correctly. The 8 components of the pressure protocol. Physiological optimization begins with breathing. This is not a soft, metaphorical prescription. This is direct nervous system manipulation. The box breathing protocol. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. Has been shown in controlled research to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, directly counteracting the most performance-degrading effects of the stress response, while preserving the energy and heightened awareness that make pressure useful. Elite performers practice this until it becomes automatic, not a technique they remember to try under pressure, but a conditioned reflex that activates when they need it most. Cognitive reframing trains the automatic interpretation system. Instead of, I'm nervous, the trained response is, I'm ready. Instead of, this is threatening, it's, this is the environment where I perform best. These aren't positive affirmations recited into a mirror. They are practiced cognitive patterns that, through consistent repetition, become the actual default response the mind produces. Attention management under pressure addresses the fact that stress naturally narrows attention, often to exactly the wrong things. Most people under pressure fixate on what could go wrong, what others will think, what the consequences of failure might be. Elite performers have trained their attention to snap directly to process, the specific executable steps of what needs to happen, right now. Not outcomes, not implications, execution. Ritual implementation provides psychological stability when external circumstances are unstable. Every elite performer has carefully developed pre-performance routines that create a reliable internal state, regardless of the external environment. These routines aren't superstitions. They work because they are practiced so consistently that they become triggers, neurological shortcuts that automatically activate the performance state that has been associated with them through thousands of repetitions. Stress inoculation training is the preparation that makes real pressure manageable. You cannot perform under pressure you haven't trained under. Elite performers deliberately create challenging, high-stakes practice conditions. Audiences, time constraints, elevated consequences, physical fatigue added to cognitive demands, so that actual performance pressure feels familiar rather than foreign. They have already been in versions of this moment. Their nervous system knows how to respond. Failure recovery training addresses the pressure situation that most people are least prepared for. Performing well after making a mistake during a high-stakes moment. Most performers' training simply stops at executing well. Elite performers specifically practice the recovery, the immediate return to process focus after an error, the physical reset, the cognitive reorientation, because they understand that how you respond to a mistake under pressure is often more decisive than the mistake itself. Recovery acceleration recognizes that pressure situations are metabolically and psychologically expensive. Elite performers have systematic protocols for transitioning from high-stress states back to baseline efficiently without crashing. Specific breathing patterns, physical movement protocols, mental decompression practices. The goal is rapid, complete restoration of the physiological and psychological resources that pressure depletes. Pressure seeking is the quality that, over time, creates what researchers call pressure immunity. While most people instinctively avoid high-stakes situations until they're unavoidable, elite performers actively seek them out. They volunteer for the difficult presentation. They enter the harder competition. They raise the stakes in practice. They understand that pressure tolerance is a trainable quality that grows through progressive exposure, exactly like physical endurance, and that the only way to build it is to experience manageable levels of pressure consistently. The cumulative result of implementing this full protocol is a transformation in your relationship with pressure that most people never experience. Pressure stops being a threat to your performance. It becomes a tool for your performance. The same conditions that degrade others become conditions that activate your highest capabilities. Elite performers don't perform despite pressure. They perform through it. And the best among them would tell you that they actually perform because of it. That the elevated state created by high stakes produces a quality of focus, energy, and precision that simply isn't accessible in low-pressure environments. Pressure is not your enemy. It is an invitation to access a version of yourself that most people never meet. The pressure protocol is how you make sure you're prepared to accept that invitation every time it arrives. The recovery and optimization loop, the system that makes excellence. Last, here's the performance secret that almost nobody talks about. The most elite performers in the world are not just better at performing. They are dramatically better at recovering from performing. And they treat recovery not as the passive restoration of energy, but as an active optimization system that makes them systematically better after every single performance cycle. This is how sustained excellence works. Not through unlimited willpower, not through grinding harder than everyone else into perpetuity. Through a precision system that extracts every possible learning and growth opportunity from each performance, fully rebuilds every depleted resource, and returns you to the next cycle, not just restored, but upgraded. Most people's approach to recovery is simple. Rest until you feel ready, then go again. Elite performers understand that this approach leaves most of the available gains on the table. The recovery period isn't downtime. It's part of the performance system itself. The principle is this: you can only perform at the level you can recover to. If your recovery doesn't fully restore your depleted systems, your baseline degrades over time regardless of how talented you are. If your recovery doesn't include systematic optimization, your ceiling stays fixed no matter how hard you work. The recovery loop is what separates performers who peak for a season from performers who peak for a decade. Component 1. Physiological recovery. Peak performance creates predictable physiological depletion, nervous system fatigue from sustained intense focus and decision-making, muscular fatigue from physical demands, hormonal imbalance from stress and effort, and the accumulation of metabolic waste products in the brain that directly impair subsequent cognitive performance. The foundation of physiological recovery is sleep, specifically optimized sleep. Elite performers don't just try to get enough hours. They engineer their sleep environment and routines with the same precision they bring to performance preparation. The optimal sleep environment for performance recovery is cooler than most. People maintain 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, completely dark and acoustically consistent. Melatonin production, crucial for sleep quality and the repair processes it enables, is disrupted by even small amounts of light. Growth hormone, released during deep sleep to repair neural and muscular tissue, is suppressed by elevated core temperature. Pre-sleep routines matter as much as the sleep environment. Elite performers wind down deliberately, reducing cognitive stimulation, screen exposure, and physical intensity in the 60 to 90 minutes before sleep to allow the nervous system to downshift from performance state to recovery state. Sleep entered gradually from a calmer baseline produces more deep sleep and REM sleep than sleep entered abruptly from a high activation state. Post-performance nutrition, particularly in the critical 30 to 60-minute window immediately following intense performance, directly determines the efficiency of the recovery process. During this window, the body's repair mechanisms are maximally activated and receptive to the amino acids, carbohydrates, and fluids that power them. Elite performers don't leave this window to chance. Active recovery, light movement that promotes circulation without adding additional stress, often outperforms complete rest for physiological recovery. Gentle movement helps clear the metabolic byproducts that accumulate during intense performance, delivers nutrients to recovering tissues, and maintains the neuromuscular patterns that passive rest can dull. Component 2. Psychological recovery. Mental performance creates mental depletion just as surely as physical performance creates physical depletion. Attention, decision-making capacity, stress tolerance, and emotional regulation are all finite resources that become exhausted under peak performance demands. Attention restoration is the first priority. After extended focused cognitive work, the prefrontal cortex needs genuine rest, not switching to a different demanding task, but actual disengagement from directed attention. Research has consistently shown that time in natural environments provides a particularly effective form of attentional recovery, engaging what researchers call soft fascination, a low-effort, restorative form of attention that allows the focused attention network to fully rebuild its capacity. Emotional processing is the recovery component that most high achievers neglect and most underperform because of. Peak performance involves intense emotional experiences, the satisfaction of excellent execution, the frustration of mistakes, the anxiety of high stakes, the specific weight of each outcome. Unprocessed emotional residue from previous performance experiences doesn't disappear. It accumulates, creating anxiety, distraction, and subtle but real performance interference in subsequent efforts. Elite performers process deliberately. Structured journaling, conversations with trusted coaches or mentors, mindfulness practices that allow emotional experiences to be acknowledged and integrated rather than suppressed. The goal is not emotional catharsis but cognitive completion, transforming raw emotional experience into processed understanding that informs rather than encumbers future performance. Cognitive processing extracts the analytical learning from each performance. Separate from the emotional experience of a performance is the informational content. What patterns appeared? What decisions worked? What processes need refinement? Elite performers conduct systematic post-performance analyses, not emotional autopsies, but factual reviews that identify specific variables that contributed to outcomes and translate those insights into updated strategies. Component 3. Systematic optimization. The distinguishing characteristic of elite recovery is that it doesn't just restore previous capability. It builds new capability. Elite performers use every recovery period as an active improvement cycle. Skill refinement during recovery targets the specific areas that performance analysis identifies as highest leverage opportunities for improvement, not random practice, not working on what's already strong because it feels good. Focused development of the precise capabilities that analysis shows would have the greatest positive impact on next cycle performance. System enhancement continuously refines the processes and infrastructure that support performance. Elite performers regularly audit their preparation systems, training methods, recovery protocols, and support structures, asking not just what's working, but what could work better. Small systematic improvements that compound invisibly until the advantage they create is enormous. Capacity building develops the foundational physical, mental, and knowledge capabilities that underlie all specific skills. While skill refinement improves particular techniques, capacity building improves the underlying systems those techniques run on. Expanded attention span, enhanced stress tolerance, deeper strategic understanding. These foundational upgrades multiply the effectiveness of every specific skill built on top of them. Component 4. Integration and preparation. The transition from recovery back to performance requires deliberate management. New skills, insights, and optimizations developed during recovery need to be integrated carefully into existing performance systems, tested progressively, at lower stakes first, before being deployed in high-stakes situations. Mental rehearsal is the bridge between recovery and performance. Elite performers use this phase to visualize precisely how new capabilities will function in upcoming performance situations, identifying potential challenges before they emerge in real execution and ensuring that new elements are neurologically integrated rather than theoretically understood. Component 5. Monitoring and calibration. Elite performers don't assume their recovery and optimization processes are working. They measure them. Recovery dashboards, systematic tracking of both objective indicators, performance metrics, physiological measurements, and subjective indicators, energy, confidence, motivation, cognitive clarity, provide early warning when recovery is incomplete or optimization processes need adjustment. The monitoring component closes the loop. Data from performance informs recovery priorities. Recovery outcomes inform optimization focus. Optimization results inform preparation strategy, and preparation quality shows up in performance data. Every element feeds every other element in a system that becomes more precise over time. The result: implement this loop consistently and you develop what researchers call sustainable peak performance. Not occasional moments of excellence, but a reliable baseline of high-level output that can be maintained indefinitely because it's supported by a recovery and optimization system that continuously rebuilds and upgrades the resources it demands. More than that, you develop anti-fragile development. Instead of being gradually worn down by the accumulated demands of high performance, you become stronger and more capable with each cycle. The intensity of the demands becomes the mechanism of growth rather than the mechanism of decline. This is how the performers who dominate their fields for decades rather than years operate, not through greater natural gifts, not through access to secret techniques, through a systematic approach to the full performance cycle: preparation, execution, recovery, optimization, and back again. That makes every iteration slightly better than the one before. Champion psychology, the mindset that makes excellence permanent. There is a moment in every high performer's journey when everything changes. It's not the moment they win the championship, close the historic deal, or receive the recognition that marks them as elite. It happens before all of that. It's the moment they make a decision that most people never consciously make at all. I'm not doing this to achieve a destination. I'm doing this to become a person for whom excellence is the only way of operating. This is the distinction between champions who flame out after one great season and champions who last careers, between executives who peak early and then coast on past success and executives who compound their impact over decades, between performers who achieve briefly and performers who sustain. The psychology of long-term excellence is structurally different from the psychology of short-term achievement. Short-term success can be powered by motivation, external pressure, or the energy of a new challenge. Long-term excellence requires something that runs deeper and doesn't depend on any of those things remaining constant. It requires a complete transformation in how you understand your own identity as a performer. The three traps that end careers before examining the principles of champion psychology. It's worth understanding the three psychological patterns that most reliably destroy excellence in people who have already achieved significant success. Destination thinking is the belief that success is a place you arrive at and then maintain from. The performer works intensely toward a goal, achieves it, and then naturally reduces effort, because the achievement signals that the work is done. This pattern is psychologically seductive because it promises that the suffering will end. And it ends careers. There is no maintaining position in any high-performance domain. You are either improving or you are declining. The moment you believe you've arrived, the decline has already begun. Achievement addiction creates performers whose psychological fuel is the hit of external recognition. They chase bigger and bigger achievements not out of genuine passion for excellence, but because they've become dependent on the emotional reward of hitting milestones. The problem is that achievement-based satisfaction has rapidly diminishing returns. Each accomplishment produces a shorter, less intense reward, requiring escalating stakes to generate the same feeling. Eventually, the system breaks down in burnout, emptiness, or both. Identity confusion is perhaps the most damaging. Many high achievers construct their sense of self entirely around their results. When they're winning, their identity is intact. When results dip, and in every long career they will, their sense of self collapses with it. This creates a catastrophic vulnerability. The better you performed in the past, the more devastating a downturn becomes, because more of your identity is riding on it. Champion psychology is, in a fundamental sense, the antidote to all three traps simultaneously. The 7 principles of champion psychology. Identity-based performance inverts the relationship between who you are and what you achieve. Average achievers base their identity on their results. Champions base their results on their identity. When you are the kind of person who is committed to excellence, not as a goal but as a fundamental characteristic of how you operate, your performance flows from that identity rather than defining it. A bad day doesn't threaten your sense of self because your sense of self isn't riding on the day's results. Your commitment to the process is stable, regardless of outcome fluctuations. Building process identity requires a specific practice, consistently asking, what would someone who is committed to excellence do right now? Rather than, what do I feel like doing? Every time you choose the answer that aligns with your process identity over the answer that feels easier or more comfortable, you are installing the identity more deeply. Every compromise in the other direction weakens it. Infinite game thinking, articulated brilliantly by philosopher James Karst, distinguishes between games played to win, finite games which end when someone wins, and games played to keep playing, infinite games which have no fixed endpoint. Most ambitious people are playing a finite game, trying to reach a destination, beat a competitor, achieve a specific level of success, Once they win, the game ends and motivation dissolves. Champions are playing an infinite game. They are not trying to win against the field. They are trying to keep improving, keep expanding the frontier of their own capabilities, keep playing at the highest level for as long as possible. This reframe transforms the motivational structure completely. You're no longer competing against external standards that, once met, remove the reason to push further. You're competing against your own previous best, a ceiling that rises every time you reach it. Systematic progression recognizes that elite performance sustained over decades doesn't happen by accident or through generalized effort. It happens through carefully sequenced development of specific capabilities, targeted at the highest leverage opportunities for growth, executed with the kind of patience that allows compound improvement to accumulate into transformative results. Champions map their development in phases, not just "I want to be better," but in this phase, I'm specifically developing this capability through these practices, with these success metrics, across this timeline. They then execute that plan with the kind of patience that most people interpret as lack of ambition, understanding that slow, deliberate development creates permanent capability, while rushed development creates fragile, temporary performance. Adaptive excellence is the quality that separates good performers in stable environments from champions in dynamic ones. The world changes. What generates excellent performance in any domain is constantly evolving. The techniques, strategies, and mental models that created success yesterday may not be sufficient for success tomorrow. Champions hold their commitment to excellence constant while holding their methods for achieving excellence loosely. They actively challenge their own assumptions. They seek out evidence that their current approach needs updating. They experiment deliberately and systematically. They are never so attached to a particular method that they can't evolve it when evidence demands evolution. Legacy consciousness expands the motivational horizon beyond personal achievement. Champions understand at some deep level that their performance matters not just for themselves, but for what it demonstrates, inspires, and creates for others. This transpersonal motivation, drawn from the sense of contributing to something larger than personal success, is more sustainable than any personal drive because it doesn't depend on personal outcomes to remain meaningful. When you understand yourself as someone whose excellence raises the standard for what's possible in your domain, who creates a blueprint that others can follow, who demonstrates what the full human commitment to growth can produce, the stakes of your daily practice become genuinely larger than they were before. And that larger stake creates deeper commitment. Resilience architecture is the systematic development of the psychological infrastructure that allows you to absorb adversity without losing your commitment to excellence. Not the wishful hope that things will bounce back. The deliberate construction of specific capabilities, stress tolerance, failure recovery protocols, emotional regulation skills, and support relationships that provide honest perspective and genuine encouragement during difficult periods. Champions don't become resilient through experience of hardship alone. They become resilient by deliberately processing hardship in ways that build capacity rather than just survival. By asking, "What does this develop in me?" rather than just, "How do I get through this?" Continuous renewal addresses the reality that even the deepest, most genuinely held commitments need to be periodically refreshed. The daily demands of pursuing excellence can quietly accumulate into a weight that obscures the meaning behind the effort. Champions build in regular practices of returning to their foundational motivations, reconnecting with why they started, what they value, why the pursuit of excellence actually matters to them. They treat this renewal not as a weakness, but as a maintenance requirement for the psychological infrastructure that everything else runs on. The integration, These 7 principles converge into a single fundamental shift from achievement-oriented thinking to development-oriented thinking. The achievement-oriented mind asks, "What do I want to achieve?" It sets a target, works toward it, and either succeeds or fails. Its emotional state fluctuates with results. Its motivation depends on progress being visible and reasonably rapid. It is ultimately finite, because every achievement reached removes it as a motivational target. The development-oriented mind asks, "Who do I want to become?" It sets a direction, not a destination, and moves toward it with patience and consistency. Its emotional state is anchored to process rather than outcomes. Its motivation comes from the intrinsic satisfaction of growth itself, rather than from external recognition. It is infinite, because there is no final version of yourself to become. There is always a next level. Champions are development-oriented thinkers who have integrated the commitment to growth so deeply into their identity that it no longer requires conscious management. Excellence isn't something they maintain through effort. It's something they express through existence. And here is perhaps the most important truth in this entire audiobook. That integration is available to you. It doesn't require unique gifts. It doesn't require optimal circumstances. It requires exactly what elite performers in every domain have demonstrated it requires: the decision to pursue the psychology of peak performance with the same systematic commitment that they bring to every other aspect of their craft. The principles are proven. The research is clear. The path is laid out in front of you. The only remaining question is the one that has always been the real question. Are you ready to become someone for whom excellence isn't occasional, but inevitable? Because once you commit to that transformation, once you stop working on your performance and start working on your psychology, there is genuinely no ceiling on what you can achieve or who you can become. This is not motivation. This is not a pep talk. This is a description of how the human mind actually works at its highest level of development, and an invitation to build yours to operate the same way. The work begins when you decide it does. Begin now. The mental rehearsal blueprint. Programming your mind before the moment arrives. There is a practice used by virtually every consistently high-performing human being across every domain of elite achievement. A practice so well documented, so reliably effective, and so consistently underutilized by average performers that it functions almost like a cheat code for the human brain. It's not a morning routine. It's not journaling. It's not meditation, though that's related. It's mental rehearsal, structured, deliberate, neurologically sophisticated visualization, and most people who try it do it wrong. Here's why it matters more than almost any other mental conditioning practice. Your brain cannot reliably distinguish between a real experience and one vividly imagined. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented neurological reality. When you vividly imagine performing a skill with sufficient sensory detail, emotional presence, and physical specificity, the motor cortex activates, the relevant neural pathways fire, and the brain creates synaptic connections that are functionally nearly identical to those created by physical execution of that skill. A landmark study at the Cleveland Clinic found that participants who spent 15 minutes per day mentally rehearsing a finger exercise for 12 weeks increased muscular strength in that finger by 35%. Without ever physically performing the exercise, the neural rehearsal alone created measurable physical adaptation. Professional golfers visualize every shot before executing it. Olympic sprinters run their races in their minds dozens of times before the starting gun fires. Elite military units mentally rehearse operation sequences until every member can execute every role flawlessly in their imagination. Because the brain that has experienced that success in vivid mental rehearsal responds more calmly and precisely when the real scenario arrives. But the power of mental rehearsal extends far beyond skill refinement. For peak performance psychology, its most important applications are these: pressure inoculation. Through rehearsal, every situation that currently produces anxiety does so in part because it feels unfamiliar. Your brain's threat detection system responds more intensely to the unknown than to the known. Mental rehearsal transforms high-stakes situations from unknown to familiar, not because you physically experienced them, but because you've experienced them neurologically dozens or hundreds of times in vivid, precise mental simulation. Elite performers don't walk into their most important moments cold. They walk in having already been there, in their minds, so many times that the situation feels less like unfamiliar territory and more like a place they visited before. The process: find a quiet space, close your eyes, and systematically recreate the performance environment with as much sensory detail as possible. The sounds of the venue, the physical sensations of your body in performance mode, the faces in the room if relevant, the feel of the materials in your hands, the temperature and quality of the air. Then perform. In your mind, execute the performance at your absolute best. Not a sanitized, easy version of it, but the real thing, with real resistance and real stakes. Feel the pressure. Move through it. Execute with precision. Reach the successful outcome. Do this consistently and you are literally programming your nervous system's response to that category of situation. When the real moment arrives, your brain recognizes the pattern and routes it through the trained response rather than the threat response. Failure recovery rehearsal. Most visualization practitioners visualize only success. Elite performers also rehearse recovery. Deliberately imagine things going wrong, a mistake, an unexpected obstacle, a moment where your prepared approach isn't working, and then mentally rehearse your precise response. The breath, the physical reset, the cognitive reorientation back to process focus, the recovery and continuation. This is arguably more important than success visualization because the defining characteristic of elite performers under pressure isn't that they don't make mistakes. It's that their recovery from mistakes is faster and more complete than anyone else's. That recovery is trained, including in mental rehearsal. Identity rehearsal. Perhaps the most profound application of mental rehearsal is practicing being the version of yourself you're committed to becoming. Most people visualize performance scenarios. Elite performers also visualize themselves as performers, how they carry themselves, how they respond to challenges, how they feel in their body when fully operating from their process identity. They rehearse not just the performance, but the performer. This identity rehearsal accelerates the integration of the champion psychology. Every mental rehearsal session where you experience yourself as someone operating from complete commitment to excellence is a session that makes that identity more accessible in real performance situations. The technical protocol. For mental rehearsal to produce elite-level results, it requires 4 elements. Specificity. Generic visualization produces generic results. The rehearsal must recreate the specific performance environment, the specific challenges you'll face, and the specific responses you intend to execute. Sensory richness. The more senses engaged, the more neurologically powerful the rehearsal. Visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and even olfactory detail all strengthen the neural imprint. Emotional presence. Rehearsing without emotion is rehearsing without fuel. You must feel the stakes, feel the pressure, and feel the satisfaction of excellent execution for the rehearsal to create the neurological patterns you're building. Consistent repetition. A single visualization session produces minimal effect. 300 sessions over a year creates a neurological infrastructure that transforms performance. The investment, 10 to 15 minutes per day, done consistently, produces measurable changes in performance within weeks and transformative changes within months. Elite performers treat mental rehearsal as non-negotiable preparation, not a nice addition to the real work, but a core component of the real work, because the brain that has rehearsed the performance extensively shows up to the actual performance fundamentally differently than the brain that hasn't. You are always either training your brain or you're not. Mental rehearsal ensures that even in the quiet moments, the commute, the hour before sleep, the morning before the day begins, you're training. The feedback architecture, how elite performers use criticism as fuel. There is a conversation that happens thousands of times every day in organizations, locker rooms, studios, and practice facilities across America. A person receives feedback about their performance, and in that moment the gap between elite performers and average performers becomes visible in real time. Average performers receive feedback, and their nervous system activates a threat response. The same stress cascade that pressure triggers activates in response to criticism. The face tightens, the posture closes. The mind begins constructing defensive explanations rather than absorbing new information. The feedback that could accelerate improvement by months or years instead creates a conversation the recipient is trying to end as quickly as possible. Elite performers receive feedback, and their minds do something entirely different. They get hungry. This difference is not temperamental. It is trained. And it is, in practical terms, one of the most significant competitive advantages available to any performer, because the quality and quantity of feedback you can actually absorb and act on determines the speed at which you improve, perhaps more directly than any other variable. Why most people reject the very thing that would make them great. The defensive response to feedback is not a personal failure. It is the predictable output of a psychological system designed around protecting ego rather than developing capability. When you have built your identity around being competent, when your sense of worth as a performer is tied to how well you're currently performing, feedback that identifies a weakness is interpreted as a threat to your self-concept. The brain responds to self-concept threats with the same defensive mechanisms it uses against social threats. You become biologically motivated to dismiss, minimize, or reframe the feedback in ways that neutralize the threat. The tragic result: the people who most need the feedback, who would benefit most from the direct, unsparing assessment of what's not working, are precisely the people least able to receive it. Their ego protection prevents the very information transfer that would close the gap between where they are and where they want to be. Elite performers have solved this problem at the identity level. When your identity is built around commitment to growth rather than around current competence, feedback changes character entirely. It stops being a threat and becomes an asset, a precise diagnostic tool pointing directly at the next improvement opportunity. The feedback architecture elite performers don't just have a better attitude toward feedback. They have a systematic architecture for generating, receiving, and deploying feedback as a performance optimization tool. Feedback seeking is active, not passive. Elite performers do not wait for feedback to arrive. They pursue it aggressively, specifically seeking out the harshest, most direct assessment available. They identify the people in their environment who have the most accurate view of their performance gaps: coaches, peers, competitors, even critics. And they deliberately cultivate those relationships because they understand that comfortable feedback maintains comfort, while accurate feedback creates growth. The question elite performers ask that most people never ask What is the one thing about my performance that is most limiting my results that I'm probably not aware of? This question, asked with genuine openness to the answer, consistently produces feedback that no standard evaluation process generates because it invites the honest, specific assessment that most people signal through their behavior they don't actually want. Feedback filtering, distinguishing between actionable signal and emotional noise, is a critical skill that average performers lack. Not all feedback is equally valuable. Some feedback reflects the perspective of someone with genuine insight into your performance domain. Some reflects the preferences of someone who doesn't understand your goals. Some is accurate. Some is projection. Elite performers have developed the capacity to process large volumes of feedback quickly, extracting what's genuinely useful without being destabilized by what isn't. The filter question. Is this feedback based on an accurate understanding of what I'm trying to achieve, delivered by someone with genuine visibility into how I'm performing? If yes, it deserves full attention and serious analysis. If not, it can be noted without being acted upon. Feedback integration turns assessment into action. Elite performers have a systematic process for translating feedback into specific behavioral changes. What exactly does this feedback suggest I should do differently? In what specific situations? How will I know if the change is producing the intended improvement? When will I reassess? Without this integration process, feedback evaporates. The insight is genuinely received in the moment and then disappears into the noise of daily life, producing no actual change in performance. Elite performers close the loop by building the specific behavioral change directly into their next practice cycle. Feedback creation is the most sophisticated component, designing performance situations that generate the specific feedback you need. Elite performers don't just receive feedback reactively, they construct experiences, specific practice scenarios, deliberate challenges, performance simulations, engineered to reveal particular performance gaps and generate targeted information about how to close them. This is the level at which the feedback architecture becomes a genuine performance engine, rather than a response protocol. Instead of waiting to find out where you're weak, you design experiences that will show you. Handling the hardest feedback. Every performer eventually receives feedback that feels devastating. Feedback that challenges not just a particular skill, but the foundational assumption that they're on the right path. Feedback delivered in a way that feels like an attack rather than an assessment. Feedback that arrives at the worst possible moment. The protocol for handling this feedback is the same as the protocol for handling pressure. Interpret before you react. Before responding to any piece of difficult feedback, elite performers ask, what is the information content here? Stripped of the delivery and the emotional charge, is there something accurate in this that I need to hear, even if the way it was delivered makes it hard to hear? What would I want to do with this information if I could set aside my emotional response to it? These questions create space between the emotional reaction and the behavioral response. That space is where the learning lives. The compound effect. Here is why feedback architecture matters so much over long careers. Improvement is roughly proportional to the quality and quantity of feedback you can absorb and act on over time. A performer who absorbs 90% of the available feedback in their environment and converts it to behavioral change will improve at a fundamentally different rate than a performer who absorbs 30%. Given enough time, 2 years, 5 years, a decade, this difference in feedback absorption creates a performance gap that looks from the outside like a difference in natural talent. It isn't. It's a difference in feedback architecture. And feedback architecture is entirely trainable. The performers who sustain excellence over long careers are almost invariably the ones who never lose their hunger for accurate assessment of where they can be better. They stay students of their own performance long after they've achieved results that would justify coasting on established reputation, because they understand something that the comfortably successful often forget. The moment you stop genuinely wanting to know what you don't know about your own performance is the moment your decline begins, quietly, invisibly, and inevitably. The environment architecture, building the external infrastructure for internal excellence. Peak performance psychology is the foundation, but foundations need the right environment to build on. Elite performers don't just develop their minds, they systematically design the environments, physical, social, digital, and temporal, that support their minds in operating at peak levels. They understand that willpower is finite, that motivation fluctuates, and that the most reliable way to produce excellent behavior consistently is to build environments where excellent behavior is the path of least resistance. This is environment architecture, the deliberate design of your surrounding conditions to remove friction from your highest performance and add friction to your lowest. The physical environment. Your physical workspace communicates constantly with your nervous system, and your nervous system responds to those communications, whether you're aware of them or not. Visual clutter activates low-level cognitive processing that quietly depletes the resources available for focused performance. Temperature affects alertness and cognitive efficiency. Slightly cool environments, 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, consistently produce better cognitive performance than warmer ones. Lighting influences circadian rhythm, mood, and energy levels throughout the day. The presence or absence of natural elements, views of nature, plants, natural light, has been shown to measurably affect stress levels and attention recovery capacity. Elite performers who do deep cognitive work design their workspaces to minimize every unnecessary cognitive demand. Surfaces contain only what the current task requires. Equipment is optimally arranged to reduce physical friction. Lighting is intentionally designed for the time of day and type of work. The environment has been audited and calibrated as deliberately as the mental training that happens within it. This isn't aesthetics. It is performance infrastructure. The social environment, perhaps the most powerful determinant of long-term performance trajectory, is the social environment. The people you spend your most significant time around, the standards they hold, and the conversations that characterize your most important relationships. Research on social contagion consistently shows that behaviors, beliefs, and performance standards are highly contagious. The people you're closest to don't just influence you, they calibrate you. Their standards become your baseline. Their ceiling becomes your expectation. Their conversations become your thinking. Elite performers are ruthlessly intentional about this, not cold or dismissive of people who don't match their ambitions, but clear-eyed about the fact that proximity to people operating at higher standards is one of the most reliable accelerants of their own development. They seek mentors and coaches who have achieved what they're working toward, not for tactical advice only, but for the calibration of being regularly in the presence of someone for whom the level you're reaching for is simply normal. They build peer groups of people pursuing similar levels of excellence, where the shared standard raises everyone's performance through the compounding effect of mutual accountability and mutual modeling. They are careful about extended exposure to relationships characterized by comfortable mediocrity, not because mediocre people are bad, but because comfortable mediocrity is contagious in exactly the same way excellence is. Your social environment is either your most powerful performance tool or your most powerful performance limit. Elite performers make it the former through conscious, consistent design. The digital environment. The average American spends over 7 hours per day consuming digital content. Most of that consumption is not chosen. It is prompted by notifications, algorithm-driven feeds and habit loops, engineered by platforms whose business model depends on maximizing your time on their service regardless of whether that time serves your goals. Elite performers treat their digital environment with the same design intentionality they bring to their physical and social environments. They audit regularly. What's on my phone is serving me. What is simply there because removing it requires effort I haven't made. They implement structural barriers between themselves and high-distraction digital environments during performance periods, not willpower barriers, physical ones, deleted apps, scheduled access windows, devices in different rooms. They understand that the strength of the attention economy means that willpower is not a reliable defense. Environmental design is. They are equally intentional about what digital content they actively consume. The information environment you immerse yourself in shapes your thinking, your assumptions, your sense of what's possible, and your understanding of the highest standards in your domain. Elite performers curate this environment with the goal of consistent exposure to the thinking, work, and standards of the best in their field. The temporal environment. The structure of how you allocate time is perhaps the most revealing reflection of what you actually value, as opposed to what you say you value. Elite performers design their temporal environment around a simple principle. Protect the time for the work that most directly develops your highest capabilities. Everything else, meetings, administrative tasks, social obligations, consumption, is arranged around that protected core rather than competing with it for the highest quality cognitive hours. Research on circadian performance patterns consistently shows that most people have a 2 to 4 hour window of peak cognitive performance during the first half of their day. Most people spend that window on email. Elite performers spend it on the work that demands their best thinking. The preparation, the deep practice, the strategic planning that moves their performance forward. Time architecture also means building in the recovery and reflection periods that the recovery and optimization loop requires. Not just time for work. Time for the integration of learning, the processing of performance experience, and the systematic optimization that keeps the performance cycle improving. The habit architecture. Underlying all environmental design is the recognition that most human behavior is habitual, automatically triggered by environmental cues rather than consciously chosen in each moment. Elite performers design habit architectures that make their highest performance behaviors automatic. This means identifying the environmental triggers that reliably produce the behaviors you want. The specific location that activates deep focus. The physical warm-up sequence that triggers the performance state. The end-of-day review ritual that activates the recovery and reflection mode. Then, engineering those triggers into your environment so that the behavior follows automatically without requiring conscious decision. It also means identifying and eliminating the environmental triggers that reliably produce behaviors you don't want. The phone on the desk that triggers checking behavior. The social media app on the home screen that activates scroll behavior when anxiety strikes. The comfortable chair in front of the television that activates passive consumption when energy is low. Elite performers understand that they will not consistently outperform the habits their environment triggers. So they build an environment that triggers elite habits. The integration physical environment, social environment, digital environment, temporal environment, and habit architecture are not separate systems. They interact. They reinforce each other. A well-designed physical workspace combined with a socially accountable peer group, combined with a distraction-free digital environment, combined with temporally protected deep work periods, creates a compound effect that is far more powerful than the sum of its parts. Elite performance at the highest sustained levels is not just an internal game, it is a systems game. The performers who maintain excellence over years and decades have almost invariably built external architectures that support their internal psychology, that remove the friction from their best behaviors and add friction to their worst. You cannot think your way to elite performance in an environment designed for mediocrity. You can build your way to elite performance by designing environments that make excellence the default. This is the final piece of the system. Not just what you think, but where you think it. Not just how you develop yourself, but what surrounds that development. Not just your internal architecture, but the external architecture that keeps the internal architecture performing at its highest level. Build both, sustain both, and the results will follow with a reliability that looks, from the outside, a lot like genius, but you'll know better. The consistency code. Why elite performers show up when everyone else doesn't. Let's talk about the most unsexy secret in peak performance. Not the dramatic comeback, not the championship-winning shot, not the defining moment everyone sees and remembers. The thing that actually creates all of those moments. The invisible foundation underneath every peak performance story is something far less cinematic. It's showing up every day, especially on the days when you don't feel like it. Consistency is not a motivational concept. It is a neurological one. Every behavior you perform repeatedly under similar conditions becomes progressively more automatic because your brain is literally building physical infrastructure, networks of myelinated neural pathways that make the behavior faster, more efficient, and less cognitively demanding each time. The technical term is automaticity. The performance term is second nature. Elite performers who seem to execute under pressure with superhuman ease aren't superhuman. They've just automated excellence through such extreme repetition that performing at a high level requires less conscious effort than average performance requires for most people. But there's a requirement for this to work. The repetition has to actually happen. Not on the days you're inspired. Not on the days when conditions are perfect and motivation is high. On the days when you're tired, discouraged, distracted, and fully capable of generating a convincing list of reasons why today is a legitimate exception. Elite performers have cracked the consistency code by solving 3 specific problems that derail most people's attempts to show up daily. Problem 1. The motivation dependency. The most common reason people don't show up consistently is that they've made their practice contingent on motivation. When they feel motivated, they work. When they don't, they don't. This sounds reasonable. It produces wildly inconsistent development. Motivation, by its nature, is reactive. It rises in response to inspiration, novelty, and positive momentum. It falls in response to fatigue, setbacks, and the inevitable grinding stretches that every long development journey contains. Making your practice dependent on motivation means that your development becomes as inconsistent as your emotional state, which is to say, highly variable. Elite performers have made a fundamental shift, and they no longer ask whether they feel motivated. They ask whether it's time. Showing up is on the schedule. The schedule runs. Full stop. This isn't suppression of emotion. It's a structural solution to a structural problem. Instead of fighting the days when motivation is low, which burns mental energy and often fails anyway, elite performers have built systems where the action happens before the motivational question is even fully formulated. The behavior is triggered by time and environment, not by internal state. Problem 2. The perfectionism trap. The second most common consistency killer is perfectionism. Specifically, the implicit standard that practice only counts if it's optimal. If you don't have the full 2 hours, the perfect environment, the right energy level, and complete focus, the session doesn't happen. This standard sounds high. It produces less development than doing something imperfect every single day. Elite performers have a different rule. Something always beats nothing, and done always beats perfect. A 30-minute abbreviated session on a difficult day isn't ideal. It's dramatically better than zero because it maintains the chain of behavioral repetition that builds automaticity. It sustains the identity of someone who shows up, and it often produces surprising quality despite suboptimal conditions. The consistency chain matters more than the quality of any individual session. Broken chains are hard to restart. Unbroken chains build momentum that eventually makes the hard days feel easier. Problem 3. The recovery misread. The third consistency killer is mistaking legitimate recovery need for avoidance. Elite performers have developed the capacity to accurately distinguish between these two very different internal states, a skill that takes deliberate development. Legitimate recovery need feels like physical depletion, cognitive fog, or the specific heaviness that signals genuine overtraining. It requires actual rest, and ignoring it degrades performance. Avoidance feels like resistance, low motivation, and the generation of reasonable-sounding reasons not to work. It does not require rest. It requires doing the work anyway. Most people treat every instance of not wanting to work as a recovery need. Elite performers have calibrated this distinction precisely, which allows them to rest when rest is genuinely needed and work through the resistance when resistance is just resistance. Building your consistency system. The practical implementation of the consistency code involves 3 components. Schedule architecture. Your most important development work should be scheduled at a specific time, in a specific location, with specific preparation steps that trigger the behavior automatically. The more behavioral specificity you build into the schedule, the less the execution depends on moment-to-moment motivation. Minimum viable session. Define the floor for what counts as showing up on a difficult day, not the ideal session. The minimum. 30 minutes. One key exercise. The single most important component. Knowing the floor prevents the all-or-nothing thinking that produces zeros. Streak tracking. Behavioral consistency is reinforced by visible evidence of the chain. Simple streak tracking, noting consecutive days of showing up, activates the loss aversion that humans are wired for. Breaking a long streak feels like a genuine loss. That feeling is motivationally useful. The compound return. Here is what makes consistency the most powerful concept in long-term performance development. The returns compound non-linearly. 2 years of showing up 90% of days doesn't produce 90% of the results that showing up 100% of days would produce. It produces a fraction of those results because the neural automaticity that creates effortless excellence requires consistent repetition to fully install. Gaps in the chain reset progress partially. Long, unbroken chains compound. The performers who seem like they were born great were almost invariably the ones who started earlier and showed up more consistently than everyone around them. The advantage isn't talent. It's accumulated repetitions, built through consistency, compounded over time. You don't need to be the most talented person in your field. You need to show up more consistently than the most talented people who aren't fully committed. That is achievable by any person willing to build the system. Show up every day, especially on the hard days. That is the code. The decision that changes everything you've just absorbed more actionable knowledge about how elite minds actually work than most people will encounter in a lifetime of consuming performance content. The research is real. The frameworks are proven. The system is complete. But here's the truth that every honest peak performance educator, eventually has to say, knowing this changes nothing. The gap between understanding elite psychology and embodying it is not closed by information. It's closed by decision, a specific kind of decision that most people never quite make, even when they've read all the right books and attended all the right seminars and genuinely believe in the principles they've absorbed. The decision is this: I'm going to become someone for whom these principles are not aspirations but operating standards. Not, I'll try to focus better. Not, I want to improve my pressure response. Not, I should work on my recovery. This is who I am now. This is how I operate. That decision, made with full clarity, owned without reservation, backed by the daily behavioral choices that either reinforce it or erode it, is the actual beginning of the transformation this audiobook describes. Everything before that decision is preparation. Everything after it is development. The 6-chapter framework you've just completed covers the full architecture. The performance paradox reveals that your psychology, not your talent, determines your ceiling. The moment you genuinely internalize this, you stop being a victim of your starting point and become an architect of your outcome. The Elite Mindset Framework gives you the 7 mental models that separate performers who occasionally reach excellence from performers who live there. These aren't personality traits. They are trained cognitive patterns that anyone can install. The mental conditioning system transforms your relationship with focus from passive hope to active skill, from wishing you could concentrate to commanding it. In an attention economy designed to keep you fragmented, this capability is genuinely rare and genuinely decisive. The pressure protocol converts your relationship with high-stakes moments from threat to opportunity. The performer who thrives under pressure isn't the one who doesn't feel it. It's the one who has trained their response to it so thoroughly that the same force that breaks others becomes the fuel that sharpens them. The recovery and optimization loop reveals the mechanism of sustained excellence, how elite performers don't just perform well once, but perform well repeatedly, improving with each cycle rather than being worn down by accumulated demands. The champion's psychology, the deepest layer, installs the identity-based foundation that makes everything else sustainable. When excellence becomes who you are rather than what you're trying to achieve, the entire relationship with performance transforms permanently. Underneath all of it runs the consistency code, the feedback architecture, the environment design, and the mental rehearsal practice that translates psychological principles into daily behavioral reality. The system is complete. The path is clear. What happens now is entirely up to you, not because effort determines outcomes, though it does, not because talent is irrelevant, though as you now know, it mostly is. Because the commitment to peak performance, made fully and backed by the systematic daily actions that give it substance, produces results that look from the outside like extraordinary gifts, but are, from the inside, the predictable output of a well-built system. You are that system now. Build it, sustain it, let it compound. The only ceiling that exists is the one you accept. The daily practice map. Your first 30 days. Every transformative system needs a starting point. Abstract principles become concrete results only through specific daily actions. The following 30-day practice map translates the full peak mind framework into a daily structure that begins the psychological rewiring process immediately. This is not an overwhelming program. It is a deliberately minimal starting structure. The minimum effective dose for beginning the transformation, designed to build behavioral momentum before adding complexity. Week 1. Foundation days 1 to 7. The Attention Foundation. Every morning 10 minutes. Basic breath-focused meditation. Sit. Close your eyes. Focus on the physical sensation of breathing. When your mind wanders, and it will wander constantly, notice it without frustration and bring your attention back. That's the entire practice. The wandering is not failure. The noticing and returning is the training. Every evening, 5 minutes. Write one sentence answering this question. What did I focus on today that actually mattered, and what pulled my attention away from it? This is your first meta-attention practice. Building awareness of how your attention is actually being deployed. Remove one digital distraction from your primary work environment. One notification silenced. One app deleted from your home screen. One trigger eliminated. Week 2. Pressure and process. Days 8 to 14. Building pressure relationship. Add to your morning practice. 5 minutes of box breathing. 4-4-4-4. Practice the breathing pattern until the rhythm feels natural. This is not relaxation practice. This is physiological control training. Begin identifying your outcome attachments. In your evening journal, note one situation from the day where you were emotionally attached to a specific outcome. What were you afraid would happen? What process were you neglecting while focused on that outcome? This is outcome independence training at the awareness level. Seek one piece of direct, honest feedback this week from someone who has clear visibility into your performance. Ask specifically, what is one thing I'm doing that's limiting my results that I might not be fully aware of? Sit with the answer. Don't defend. Don't explain. Extract what's useful. Week 3. Mental rehearsal and identity days, 15 to 21. Programming the mind. Add a 10-minute mental rehearsal session to your morning practice. Choose one specific upcoming performance situation, a meeting, a conversation, a creative challenge, and visualize executing it at your absolute best. Full sensory detail, real emotional stakes, successful outcome. Then rehearse the recovery. Imagine something going wrong and visualize your precise response. Begin the identity clarification practice. Write a single paragraph answering, what does someone who is fully committed to excellence in my domain actually look like? What do they do that I don't yet do consistently? This is the beginning of your process identity definition. Start the consistency tracking. Note each day whether you completed the core practices. The chain is beginning. Protect it. Week 4. Systems and integration days, 22 to 30. Building the full loop, conduct a performance post-mortem on one significant recent performance. A project, a presentation, a key interaction. Not an emotional evaluation. A factual one. What specifically contributed to the outcome? What would I do differently? What does this reveal about where I need to develop? Design one environmental upgrade, a specific change to your physical workspace, digital environment, or temporal structure that removes friction from your best performance behaviors or adds friction to your worst. Write your process identity statement, 3 sentences that describe who you are as a performer. Not who you hope to become, but who you are committed to being, expressed in the present tense. Read this every morning for the next 30 days. The trajectory. At the end of 30 days, you will not be a transformed performer. You will be a performer with a foundation. The attention practice will have created the first measurable improvements in your ability to focus deliberately. The pressure work will have begun rewiring how your nervous system interprets high-stakes situations. The mental rehearsal will have installed the first traces of neurological preparation for your key performance scenarios. The identity work will have begun the process of integrating a process-based self-concept. Most importantly, you will have 30 days of evidence that you are someone who shows up. That evidence is not small. The identity of a person who shows up consistently, who does the work when motivation is absent, who treats their own development as non-negotiable. That identity, accumulated through 30 consecutive days of action, is the most important asset you will build in this first month. Build from there. Add the next layer of practice. Increase the duration and complexity of the mental rehearsal. Deepen the feedback architecture. Expand the environmental design. The compound return on systematic daily practice over months and years produces results that are genuinely difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced them, because the transformation happens gradually enough to be invisible day by day, but dramatically enough to be unmistakable when you look back across the arc of a year. Start today, not because conditions are perfect, because conditions will never be perfect, and the performers who wait for perfect conditions never start. The system works. The research is clear. The path is in front of you. Begin.